With things still to be decided in some cases in the midst of what was a bitter and fractious midterm elections, the balance of power in Congress is still, well, hanging in the balance. History teaches us that the party that won the White House 2 years prior usually struggles to maintain control on Capitol Hill 2 years later. And history, of course, proved itself true again yesterday. Since 1906, there have been only 3 midterms in which the party of the president in power gained House seats. 1934, when the country struggled with the Depression. 1998, when the economy was soaring. And 2002, when President George W. Bush had a sky-high approval rating after a feeling of national unity in the wake of the attacks, September 11th. Of course, there is no national unity today. Add to the pattern today a battered economy with inflation growing, a recession looming, and fears about crime. The outcome is close to certain to repeat itself. Joining me on the morning show, Dr. Daniel Cronrath, a political science professor at FSCJ. Good morning.
Morning, Bruce. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate you being here.
Sure.
So it appears the GOP will gain control of the House, but not with a red wave as they'd hoped, but with what's called a red ripple. Control of the Senate still hanging in the balance, and Georgia could be one of the deciders. What do you make of that?
Well, it's going to be interesting. A lot of people predicted before last night that the Georgia race, at least on the Senate side, would end up going to a runoff with Senator Warnock running against Herschel Walker. I think one of the things that the GOP really need to be asking themselves this morning, if you're a Republican out there, is could this result have been different if you had had a candidate perhaps not as unconventional as Herschel Walker on the ballot? And of course, we want to know one of the reasons why Herschel Walker was on the ballot to begin with, as was Dr. Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania, is because these were candidates that were handpicked by Donald Trump. Kind of once again asking the question, is Donald Trump really a phenomenon in the GOP to his own self versus a lot of the candidates who he ends up getting involved with and endorsing, who on election day the voters just tend to reject. I think one of the really interesting things coming out of Georgia that I spotted last night, Bruce, was this idea of an undervote. There were a lot more votes cast in the race for Kemp versus Abrams than what there were with Warnock and Walker, meaning that there were voters who were going in and they just couldn't bring themselves to vote for a candidate in that race, despite the fact that they wanted to participate in the election. So it'll be really interesting in the days to come to see what that looks like and also what that might project for the runoff coming up in Georgia.
Yeah, I want to talk more about the Trump influence in a bit, but first let's talk a bit about Florida. It used to be a classic battleground state, a swing state, and it's seen a very dramatic shift, and that's evidenced by Governor DeSantis' victory. In 2018, he won by only about 30,000 votes, and yesterday he flipped at least 6 counties that he'd lost that year, same counties that were won by Joe Biden 2 years ago. Foreboding for the Democrats in 2024 unless they make an investment in Florida, because a lot of people are saying they didn't spend money this time, and that's what undid them.
Yeah, I think, you know, from my standpoint here, Bruce, I look at Florida as being a very Republican state. When you look at the governor's office, when you look at control of the state house, you know, really for the last 24 years, Florida has leaned heavily Republican. When we talk about Florida as a swing state, that really was the phenomenon called Barack Obama. When you look at the top of the ticket, Barack Obama was a once-in-a-generation politician who was able to bring a lot of people to turn out in the polls in 2008 and 2012. And since then, we've seen kind of this return with, of course, the 2018 midterm election, the first time that Governor DeSantis was elected. There was a lot of energy on the Democratic side. Again, that was a midterm election when Donald Trump was president. And we saw Andrew Gillum, of course, with a lot of energy on the Democratic side to push back against the election in 2016. So for myself, in terms of what the Florida Democrats could do differently, or what the state of Florida is right now, I think what you're seeing really is Florida finding its natural place. This is a very Republican state. For all the criticisms of statewide Democrats, you know, why aren't they, you know, why do they have former Mayor Diaz, a former Republican, running the party? Why are they running former Governor Christie, who is a Republican? It's a difficult, I think it's a difficult slog right now for the Democrats to really try to find their way through, regardless of who they would run for governor or for Senate.
Back to Washington, assuming a shift in power, a shift in the House, which will be a bigger shift than we're going to see in the Senate. The Senate might be more evenly divided. Either way, the Biden legislative agenda is in jeopardy here. What do we expect from Congress? Do we expect gridlock, less compromise?
Yeah, I expect a focus on the 2024 election with not a lot of policy actually going through Congress. Most presidents actually get the majority of what their legislative agenda is going to be done in their first 2 years. If it was former President Obama, of course, it was the Affordable Care Act. If it was Donald Trump, it was massive tax cuts. If it was President Biden, we know we saw historic investment in infrastructure. We saw a massive COVID relief bailout bill. you know, these next 2 years, I would really expect a lot of positioning for the 2024 race. I know that there's going to be things that the president's going to want to accomplish, but really we're not going to know what his ability to do that is until the next few days when we see where does control of the Senate finally rest? How many seats in the House do the Republicans pick up? Clearly, myself included, it was not the red wave, as you suggested, that we expected last night. And I think a part of that, too, is that when you look at, you know, some folks are always saying, well, how are the polls wrong? Well, first of all, most of the national polls were within the margin of error in terms of how things turned out. But then also, too, when it's just become more of a device for the media when we talk about what is the average of polls. Well, in this last cycle, we saw a lot of Republican-leaning polls thrown into the mix that were not into the mix from 2000. So more than probably you saw them skew towards the Republican candidate nationally across the board a little bit more than, say, some of the other polls that this morning when I woke up were lo and behold correct. The Siena College poll, the Marist College poll, which showed the Democrats nationally in a lot of these races doing a little bit better.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the Trump effect. He's expected to throw his hat in the ring sometime next week, 14th or 15th from Mar-a-Lago. The GOP is fractured. I mean, there's a split. You've got the establishment Republicans, you've got the Trump Republicans, and Trump says that he wants to oust Mitch McConnell.
Right.
That dynamic is going to have an impact on the 2024 race. And if Trump goes up against DeSantis, that too is going to play a role.
That's right. Grab yourself a crudité, Bruce, and sit down and just enjoy the show. I mean, that's going to be what we're all going to be doing. It's going to be very interesting. I think one of the things that Republicans need to understand that for all of Trump's bravado, the ability to actually, you know, have 3 members of the Supreme Court during a one-term president be appointed by that Republican president. You know, all Donald Trump really did was select people off of a list. That is the master of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, who was able to make that happen for nationwide Republicans. And I think that's going to be one of the things that the Republican Party really needs to understand, that Trump may be a very, very charismatic figure. He may be very popular himself at the polls. But the real architect of what the GOP has been able to accomplish, that has been Mitch McConnell in the Senate, because he's a creature of Washington. He understands how it works. He has so many markers in D.C. with people that he's spent his entire life working there. So if I were Donald Trump, at least behind the scenes, I would continue to embrace Mitch McConnell instead of publicly arguing with him. Where we go with the DeSantis and the Trump showdown is probably what a lot of Floridians are really interested to see. I am interested to see how that shakes out. And by the way, will Governor DeSantis even decide to try to enter into that arena with Donald Trump? Our governor is a young politician. He's new in his career. Will he have the patience just maybe to let Donald Trump run this cycle? But then the other problem that DeSantis will have is that in 2028, there's going to be a whole gaggle of Republicans, once Trump is gone, who are going to want to get into the race. Nikki Haley, Kristi Noem from South Dakota. There's a bunch of people who may be wanting to get involved, and they're not going to be former Vice President Mike Pence. Right. So it actually may be a little bit more crowded for Governor DeSantis then than what it would be right now for Governor DeSantis.
And 2 years is really a long time. Donald Trump has already said he doesn't want to go with a Washington insider. And then there's what the Democrats do. Joe Biden says he's going to run again. Will he? Is there some unknown in the Democratic field that could just change the entire dynamics of this race, as Jimmy Carter did all those years ago? So many unanswered questions. I guess we'll find out.
I guess we will.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Bruce.